Welcome to the Fair Perspectives Podcast, the official podcast of the pro-human movement, brought to you by the Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism. Today, I have the privilege of speaking with Chloé Valdary. Chloé is a writer and entrepreneur whose work has appeared in the New York Times, The Atlantic, Newsweek, USA Today, Tablet Magazine, The New York Post, and many other publications. She is also the founder of Theory of Enchantment, a startup which provides a compassionate version of anti-racism training. Chloé has also recently launched her own podcast entitled The Heart Speaks, which features guests like Scott Barry Kaufman and a roundtable discussion with FAIR advisors Coleman Hughes and Camille Foster, as well as American Shade host Brittany King. Today we discuss her podcast, art and working in multiple mediums, the theory of enchantment and how it differs from other anti-racism programs, how pop culture can be a tool for teaching people how to love, how obsession with identity in art can divide us, Beyoncé, the Kardashians, the victimhood mentality, responding versus reacting, and whether we can transcend race. Ladies and gentlemen, Chloé Valdary. Chloé Valdary, thank you so much for joining us on Fair Perspectives.
Thank you for inviting me, Angel. I'm so excited.
Yeah, so we actually hung out. We actually just hung out a couple of days ago here in New York. And I'm actually flying solo today. Melissa is unfortunately busy. She can't be with us, but I'm sure this will be an excellent, amazing conversation. I have you all to myself for the first time. I usually have to share attention with a bunch of other cool and interesting people. So let's see if I rise to the challenge.
Let's do it.
Yeah. So we have many things in common, but one thing that we have in common is that we have both recently launched podcasts. You are now yes. the host of the 7 billionth podcast. And
yes, called, another one. Like DJ
exactly.
Khaled, another one.
Right, exactly. So it's called The Heart Speaks. And why don't you tell me a little bit about that? Why on earth would you add another podcast to the podcasting world, right? It's a question I ask myself. So what about you?
That's a good question. I have to give a shout out to my producer, Dash Amila, who encouraged me to start a podcast. It wasn't necessarily the first thing that was top of mind that I wanted to do, the first project that I wanted to create, but I was already having conversations with people on a regular basis. And he was like, why don't you start a podcast? It's like basically something that's sitting in your hands. So you might as well, create something that can be an official platform for a lot of the conversations that you're having. And apparently it's a philosophy podcast. I say apparently because we just got some statistics that came out that said it was like that ran the numbers and said it was like the number 2 in this country and the number 16 in this country. But in all of the countries, it was all in philosophy. So the podcast gods have spoken and it's a philosophy podcast.
I can see that. Although, at the time of this recording, I believe that I've only been, there's one episode. And then there's a bonus episode, right? So your first episode was with Scott Barry Kaufman, our mutual friend. Mm-hmm. And then you had a kind of roundtable with FAIR advisors, Coleman Hughes and Camille Foster, but also the lovely Brittany King. She's wonderful as well. And I mean, I guess I can see it being a philosophy podcast in the way that you're discussing, heavy topics and you're approaching it through that kind of philosophical lens. But there's a lot of psychology. I think you mention Jung every 10 minutes or so, if not more.
Yes, I'm always coming in with but what would Jung say?
Right.
Moment. Yeah.
So what do you hope to accomplish with it now that you've been nudged into this realm of podcasting? What's your goal, right? I mean, conversation is obviously the main thing, but what about the conversation? What about The Heart Speaks, which I think is a beautiful title, especially for you. I think it's very fitting. But what about The Heart Speaks? Do you think you hope to contribute to the general, discourse?
I think that I would like for us as a society to maybe get away from hyper cerebralness, and I'm guilty of this. I can be super intellectual, super heady, and that I can use that as a defensive mechanism to not like drop into feelings and like be with the feelings and just be with what is on an emotional level. I think that both of us run in circles with a lot of academics and a lot of, intelligent people. But I think part of that can come with a bias against or a hesitancy against emotions and feelings and seeing feelings and emotions as bad, actually, which I think is a very unhealthy way of approaching the world. So if I can facilitate conversations that can encourage people to be more heartfelt, um, along with the intelligence, but also be heartfelt. I think that's what I'm trying to accomplish ultimately.
That's a good goal. I think, you and I are also, we're artists in multiple mediums, right? You make music as well. And I think, I know for me, I'm sure this is also true of you, but I know that for me, that helps me keep from being Spock,
Yeah.
It depends on it depends on the context that people know me in, but I've been accused of being a robot, because I'm trying to approach a topic that's difficult. I'm trying to approach it very dispassionately so that I can just think about the ideas and not let, my personal kind of proclivities or just emotional reactions get in the way. And we could talk about that actually, but the art, what I always say is, look, I write poetry. I sing in a band. Like I have to be connected to that sort of stuff. Otherwise the music would be terrible. Right.
Yeah.
And you have to feel, right? Like you have to be propelled by this thing. So, do you feel that aspect of your life helps you kind of keep centered and not too far into the bookworm academic thing?
Yeah, so I actually just interviewed someone who I think is having a kind of moment. My impression was that he's having a moment where he's trying to figure out how to drop into feelings. And I told him that he should go play a musical instrument. And he actually plays guitar. And I was like, go just pick up the guitar, And I play guitar as well. I picked up the guitar a few years ago. And I actually I'm a very empathic person. So when I saw that he was suffering, I kind of felt it. I felt the suffering within myself. And then I felt the need to pick up the guitar. So I actually just picked up the guitar again this weekend. And it has been a while since I've dedicated playing time. And so it was really nice. I re-downloaded Musician and started relearning some chords and stuff like that. And I want to try to do that more often. This year and last year, I wasn't able to produce music as much as I have in previous years, just because there's such a lack of time, and as a result of that, I think it's something that you have to dedicate yourself to. It's something that you have to actually allocate time towards, or else, because we live in a society that values headiness on some level and that values intellect on some level, you have to just be deliberate about the amount of time that you dedicate to the arts. Otherwise you can lose yourself in intellectualism, as I do often.
Yeah, definitely. I go through phases. That's what happens with me is, especially during COVID, I'm stuck at home. I'm in an apartment I share with my wife, and, I feel obnoxious if I were to just kind of fill the entire apartment with music, or, and she would, the first thing she would say is, that's crazy. I love it when you play, but I still feel the thing. I'm like, you don't know what you're talking about. I'm annoying.
Yeah. You feel, are you saying that you feel judged? Because I feel judged, even though I might be judging myself, really. It might just be a projection. No one's actually judging me for being musical. I like to sing around the house, but then sometimes when I sing around the house, I'm like, oh, is this okay? Am I disturbing anyone?
Right. Exactly. Yeah,
So,
it is that. And it's
yeah.
the thing of you don't want to be that guy. You know, my wife says all the time, like she says, if I could sing, I would sing everything. Like I would never speak again. I would just sing, you
Yeah.
know? And, but I tell her like, you don't know
That's
what you're talking about
beautiful.
because but you don't know what you're talking about because the minute you realize, like the minute you are that and you think about doing that, you're like, oh my God, I'm just pissing off everyone around me.
Right.
And like, gloating about my ability or whatever it is, however small that capacity is, it doesn't matter. It's just like, oh God, turn it off, stop,
But where do you think those thoughts come from though?
I think, well, for me, I think, I've always tried to avoid that lead singer type image, right? Because
Okay.
you don't want to be the center of attention. You don't want to be, or everyone assumes that that's what you want. And I definitely don't want that. It's just kind of what I fell into, right? So I was the front man of a band and having to put that James Brown energy out, right? Because I've got this big band. Yeah. Like I've got, I was in this funk band and, we literally had a horn section and it was a big, loud band. Cool. And I can't be, quiet singer-songwriter guy, right? I have to be big bravado guy. And that takes a lot of energy for me. And people get the impression that that's just how I am, but it actually takes me a while to kind of phase into that and phase out of it. So immediately before a gig and immediately after a gig, I need to be by myself and like decompress to get back into this,
Yeah.
So I've had conversations with people immediately after a show that I don't remember because they're talking to somebody else. It really feels like that, And they're like, you don't remember? We talked about this thing. I'm like, I'm sorry. You caught me right after a show. I have no idea what you were saying. I was somewhere else.
Wow.
But it's just this thing of you don't want to be overbearing and obnoxious. You don't want to be this guy like, oh, look at me, right? And I think that starts to spill over where even when you're at home and you're like, oh my God, there's somebody through the wall and maybe they can hear me and maybe I'm ruining their day.
Yeah. It's kind of ironic because, I have those same thoughts, but I mean, obviously it requires balance, but it's a kind of egotistical thought, right? For me to think that the world revolves around me so much that when I'm singing, I could be bothering someone. And it is true, I could be bothering someone, right? But still, there's a tinge of egocentrism in there that's kind of confusing.
That's true. Yeah, why would you care? Why would this rise above the level of New York traffic or someone on their phone outside? Like, why would it be more important? I don't know. That's a good point.
Yeah.
Maybe I should just do it. I mean, I'll when my wife isn't home, I'll take a shower and I'll sing in the shower and I'll feel free enough to actually be loud.
Yeah.
Because I feel
it's so funny because when I'm in the shower, that's the one place where I don't care. I will sing. Like I just, because especially it's the acoustics, there's a great reverb. It was like designed for us to sing.
Right. Yeah. It's a vocal booth. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
And I mean, and it's funny because singing is so, especially singing, you're so vulnerable. You feel naked. So when you're in the shower,
so you're like mine as naked. Well. You're like already there,
Right. And for me, I in the shower, I try to sing stuff that's really difficult for me. So I'll try to do like the Queen and that kind of stuff. That's like way, just super tough.
Yeah.
And I have a little bit of somehow the vulnerability of being alone in the shower and naked. It lets me try it. But yeah, if my wife is like on the couch, she's literally 15 feet away from the shower. Okay. So then I don't do it. You know what I mean? Then I'm
Shout out to New York apartment complexes also.
Yep, exactly. Yeah. Once I have a house, I'll like soundproof the basement or something and I'll just do whatever I want. But up until then, it's hard to kind of find the space. But also, I mean, getting back to the thing, during COVID, we were in the apartment and, the band I was in or the band I'm in now, we couldn't rehearse because we were like, we need to bubble up. So we didn't meet for a year and a half. Right. And I'm just on the couch and I feel that thing about I'm not going to break out the guitar and, make it so it's impossible for you not to hear me.
Yeah.
So I got into a different space and I got into writing much more. And that phase was happening, right? And now it's kind of, I'm phasing a little bit in between where now we're playing music again. So I get to go do that and get that energy out. And then when I'm home, I feel a little bit more like I can sit at the computer and do things. But do you feel that? Do you feel phases in your kind of creative output?
I actually think my subconscious reason for creating the Heart Speaks podcast was so that I could have all of these aspects of my life converge onto each other, so that I wouldn't feel pressured, even if it was just me creating pressure for myself. I wouldn't feel pressure to show up as the expected thing that other people are expecting, like as the intellectual, as opposed to the singer, or as opposed to the DJ or the music producer. I would rather cultivate a presence that is informed by all of these elements of myself, so that I feel comfortable to just burst out in song in the middle of a conversation about Descartes, right? Like, so I think that like that's where I'm trying to get to. But I did have the opportunity to go to these music brunches last year where my friend Tobias and his girlfriend Annika would like throw these brunches at their house, and they would just invite a bunch of people over to jam for like hours. They had all these instruments. They had piano, drums, microphones, and we would just come together and jam for 4 hours. And like, that was my musical outlet in lieu of not playing guitar. But yeah, I don't think we were meant to have these sort of like siloed aspects of ourselves. I think they're supposed to inform each other. And that's a kind of musical existence, right? To have different elements of yourself inform each other and then create a kind of harmonious balance between all of these things.
Yeah. There's also a tension, I think, that I notice because I dip into so many different areas. So I went to school for writing, and I was getting my master's in creative writing. And the vast majority of those people that I was in school with, they're writers, and like all they do is books and all they do is write. And that's their whole universe. And so that's where the imposter syndrome kicked in, where I'm like, oh, I'm just kind of like a tourist. You know what I mean? Like I write, but I'm not like these guys where it's their end all be all, and a lot of my friends who are writers, that's it for them. They like music, but they don't play music. They don't do that. They're just totally steeped into this thing. But I never liked that. I never liked the boundaries between those things. Right. And people ask me all the time, because I do these different things, what's the difference in the process, right? What's the difference between, how you engage in photography and how you do music, or how you write an essay? And for me, it's exactly the same. The process is all the same. It's all storytelling. It's all craft. It's all kind of working with these fundamental things. It just kind of manifests itself differently. But we have this kind of pull where people want you to be just the thing. They want you to just be the writer. They want you to just be the musician. They want you to just be one thing. And they kind of scoff at you when, like, actors try to put an album out, there's always a kind of side eye about it. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Weren't you just talking about, what's his name? When we were out at dinner a few days ago, you mentioned
Robert Downey Jr.,
which I had no idea he made music.
Yeah, he's like he's actually like a beautiful pianist. And you can see him. I think there's an episode of Ally McBeal where he's playing piano. And
very cool.
There's some video. Yeah, there's some video on YouTube of Sting had like a birthday party show, and Robert Downey Jr. came out and sang a song, and it's actually like great. And his album is a little weird. He has this weird kind of singing that he's doing in it. But like I spent a long time kind of fascinated by people who are doing two things at once. Yeah. So that's how I found out about him. And, Jared Leto has a band. That's pretty big. And so I'm fascinated by people who are trying to do these two things, because for such a long time, even my idea was you can't do that. You have to pick a lane,
I think for me, I grew up in an artistic environment. Like, first I wanted to be a screenwriter and a filmmaker. So there was this phase in my life where I was just writing these really bad scripts to try to learn the art of screenwriting. But I was obsessed with it. I would like crank out 120 pages like in a week.
Wow.
That's how you, but that's like a hint that it was bad, because that's way too fast. But then I was interested in politics, right? And then I found my way back to story and fiction. And then I got into guitar. I mean, there was a period where I didn't discover guitar or an interest in guitar until I moved to New York. So we're talking about the past 6 years. And there was a moment in my life where I literally deleted Netflix because I wanted to spend the hours that I was spending watching Netflix practicing and learning guitar. Wow. And so I feel like I've always been surrounded by different artistic mediums. But what impresses me about these people that you're mentioning is time management. Like, how are they able to find the time to do all of these things? And how can I hack into their lives and figure out how to do that myself? Like, that's what I want to know, Yeah,
that's really tricky. I broke it. I had a similar kind of thing as you. And I got really good advice when I was pretty young, like maybe early middle school, or in the middle of middle school, probably like 8th grade or something, where someone said, anything that you have an artistic inkling towards, you should just pursue it as much as you can right now. Yeah. Because all you're doing is going to school and you have nothing else to do. Yeah. So just fill all that time with developing these things. And that's why I got into photography. And, I flirted with the idea of screenwriting and stuff like that. And I kind of just set this schedule up for myself where I thought, all right, well, right now the main thing is the band, because that's a young man's game, right? Like I have until 25 to make that work, because after 25, nobody cares what you have to sing about, which is silly. But that was the thing. And then I was like, if I succeed at that, then I will have a certain amount of clout and people will want to read what I have to write. And so then I'll become a writer. And then once I've got those things down, then I'll have a certain kind of gravitas to myself and a certain amount of experience that I can actually get into directing film and stuff like that. Right. So I just kind of had it planned out in that way. You were really
like, yeah.
Yeah. I was like, okay, I can, like Ridley Scott is still doing movies and he's like, I don't know how old he is, but he's old. Yeah. And so I was like, okay, so I can direct movies until like I die, but I can't necessarily be like in a band until I die. Yeah. Right. Like that'll be harder to kind of deal with, right? Your body just starts to, especially for me as a singer, your body just starts to fight you with certain things. It's so I had this whole schedule, which completely just got obliterated, right? Like that doesn't make any sense. I'm still in a band now. I'm 36. Yeah. I'm still trying to make that happen. I'm a writer now, like all that stuff. If I had the bandwidth to try to make films, I probably would, but I don't. Yeah. So it's that thing, Yeah. But this is funny because all this stuff really ties into the theory of enchantment, right? In my view. And it's interesting because you mentioned people seeing you as this kind of intellectual and not really getting the feeling part. But the feeling part is so much of what I know about you and how I receive you in all this way, because, the theory of enchantment is so deeply ingrained in, the art that we love. Yeah. You're using that in that way. But I heard you kind of give your one sentence kind of elevator pitch for Theory of Enchantment the other night when we were hanging out. Someone asked you what it was. Oh, and what was it? I don't remember. You said, so someone said, what does your startup do? Oh. And you said, we teach people how to love. Yeah. And I thought that was so beautiful. And I just would love it if you would expand upon that.
Yeah, it was so funny because they immediately assumed I meant romantic love. And they sort of went into that and I was like, no, not quite. So Theory of Enchantment. What do we do? Theory of Enchantment is a startup, and we are basically giving people an anti-racism practice. And we built a practice that is rooted in this understanding of teaching people how to love, which is a very difficult practice, a nearly impossible task, actually, just because of our nature as human beings. And it's a task that takes a lifetime. So I will not, arrive at accomplishing fully the task until the fullness of my life is complete. But this is essentially what we do. And the reason why we take that approach is because racism is fundamentally a kind of us versus them way of thinking. And us versus them way of thinking usually emerges in a single individual or in a group of people, a community, when there's some kind of scarcity, when you're feeling like you have a loss of identity, which we all encounter as human beings during the course of our lives, when we feel that we have, that we're not loved, that we don't belong, when we're feeling insecure. These are not bad feelings, right? These are all parts of what it means to be human. But if we don't have the proper tools to deal with those feelings, then what we might end up doing is projecting. We might project those things that we feel, those insecurities that we have, that we dislike about ourselves, onto other people. And that creates a split, right? That creates this mechanism by which we split the world into all those people who look like this are good, all those people who look like this are bad. And it's really fundamentally a defensive mechanism. And so the practice of love is really teaching us how to unlearn casting those projectings, how to recall those projections, and how to be in right relationship with ourselves, with the complexity of ourselves, with the diversity that every single human being on earth has, so that when we see diversity in the other, we're not feeling threatened or fearful, but we can actually see it as a source of wonder and a source of enchantment, which is really where the name comes from.
But it's also tied to a lot of kind of Disney pop culture, and like I immediately get the the kind of the Disney logo when you say Theory of Enchantment. The enchantment part just becomes that kind of Tinkerbell doing the logo thing. Yeah, because that's so much of I think the brilliant part of your theory is that you tap into this thing that's already there. It's already in people's hearts and souls and spirits. It's already in our popular culture and our lexicon, and it's a common language that we all have. This love for pop culture, this love for these stories, which are, a lot of it, if not all of it, is Jungian archetypes and hero's journey type stuff, right? And so what you're doing is fascinating because you're tapping into this stuff and teasing out all these things that maybe people don't realize, like why you love The Lion King. Yeah. Right. There's something deeper there that, as artists, I think we pick up on because we know that that's the thing that resonates. Right. But maybe people who aren't artists aren't thinking about it that way. So talk about that. Talk about how you came to this kind of realization and then how you harness this stuff.
Yeah, I mean, it's so funny. Disney's latest film is Encanto, right? Which is enchantment. And it's a beautiful film.
Oh, it's amazing.
And it's very much aligned with the theory of enchantment in many ways. Yeah. But I came to really value pop culture and pop culture as a tool that could teach people how to love. Because when I was first doing the initial research for theory of enchantment, and I asked myself, is it possible to teach people how to love? I then asked myself, I told myself, maybe you can teach people how to love by figuring out what people are already in love with and figuring out why, and then using that to continue to teach people how to love. So that's what naturally led me to pop culture. Like, people already love Disney. People already love Nike. People already love Beyoncé. Like, why? Like, what is it about these brands that command such loyalty and devotion from, millions, if not billions of people, that if I could discover the answer to that, I could learn something about the human condition and I could learn something about myself. So it really came out of this questing for why we as a species gravitate towards some of the things that we gravitate towards, and why we also experience a feeling of awe, when we gravitate toward those things. It was that particular experience of awe and wonder, and sort of like feeling, I think, when I watch a Disney film, when I watch The Lion King, I just recently saw The Lion King on Broadway, which is
it's beautiful.
Incredible. Yeah. Incredible.
It's beautiful.
I always feel something sort of like larger than life or larger than myself. I feel a part of something that's larger than myself. And I think that we crave that as human beings. That's where we get meaning from. And if those experiences are what can cause us to be more open, right, and more curious about the other, then Disney becomes not simply a source of entertainment, right, but something that could actually, dare I be over dramatic, help heal the world of our, polarization and of our prejudices and of our bigotries. So, but it started with that question of what are people already in love with, and what can that teach me? What can I learn from that?
Yeah, I think we tap into that same sort of thing. I have this just uncontrollable reaction whenever a group of people is singing together or even just chanting together, right? Like, like even like the BLM protests, right? Like just hearing people say the same thing at the same time. And it's just 200 people. Like I have goosebumps now just describing this, and like there's this great video of, I think it's in Italy, and it's got to be thousands of people, right? And it's all thousands of guitarists and bass players and drummers and singers getting together, and they're all playing Learn to Fly by the Foo Fighters on this like football field or soccer field, I guess.
Yeah.
And, they shoot a video, and the whole thing was, this guy put it together, and they really wanted the Foo Fighters to come play. And so they did this huge thing, but it must have taken months. Yeah. And it's so beautiful. And, it's just a pop song. It's not like the greatest song in the world, right? It's a cool song. I like it. But man, just hearing that, just seeing those aerial shots of, there's got to be like 200 drummers. Yeah. And there's got to be thousands of singers, like everyone is singing. And it's just this beautiful thing. Like I tear up every time.
Yeah. I'm going to have to check out this video.
it's so powerful. And there's another one. There's a music festival where there's some kind of camera right behind the drum kit, and you can see the crowd, right? And like people are getting ready for another band to come on. I think it might be Green Day or something. But Bohemian Rhapsody starts playing over the loudspeakers, and the entire festival crowd, thousands and thousands of people, just start singing the song. And it's amazing, right? Like you just get these. So there's something so powerful about that unity, about that sense of, a song that was written before you were born. Yeah. And it's connecting with you like it time travels, or just that and that thing of people all loving the same thing and getting something out of it. Someone wrote a song, like someone just wrote a silly song, in their room or whatever, and recorded it. And now that person's gone, but that song is still here. Yeah. And we all still resonate with it. I feel like that's the core of the theory for I feel like that's what you're tapping into, and it's so powerful. And I think you can see, I think you can see the response. Like I've seen people who have taken your course and who've talked about it, and just, the uplift. It's such a different reaction and such a different kind of state of being that they're in than the alternative, which we do have to talk about, right? Like how do you see how do you see your program as being different from, and obviously you think it's better than these alternatives, right? Like and I agree, but I mean I have my answer, but I would love to hear what you think.
Yeah, just to note, I agree with you. There is a certain timelessness that we're trying to capture in the theory of enchantment. One of the things I like to say is that if wisdom is timeless, then we should be able to find it in both the past and in contemporary culture. And not only that, the two should rhyme in a way. The two should resonate with each other. So this is why we have in the course Kendrick Lamar next to Marcus Aurelius, right? Because there's a thread between the past and the present that we're trying to connect people to. But to answer your question, I mean, listen, the truth is, this is a hard question for me, a little bit, because I could give you all the sort of traditional reasons why I think that my program is better than some of the other anti-racism programs out there. But I also really don't think about the other anti-racism programs out there a lot. And maybe that's a problem. Maybe I should spend more time thinking about them. But I think that many of the other anti-racism programs are susceptible to, and in fact do perpetrate, that kind of us versus them way of thinking. And not deliberately. And when I say not deliberately, I just mean that, like, we're humans. We don't really know what we're doing half the time. And when we can really be super self-righteous and super zealous about justice, and for good reason, we can, when we're experiencing hardship and despair and loneliness and persecution and pain, if we don't have the proper tools to deal with those elements, then we can split the world into black and white, and continue to sort of pursue the same ideas that we're actually trying to undermine. And so a lot of the anti-racism programs that are out there inadvertently do that. So they, separate people on the basis of race. They assume the lived experiences of people based upon their skin color. And it's very bad, but it's more tragic than it is, for me at least, it's more tragic than it is like evil. Right. Elements of it, I think, are evil, but I think the more important piece is that it's actually deeply tragic.
I agree. Yeah. And I think that for me, the thing is that the core focus is different. And it's an understandable difference, right? It makes sense that the core focus of many of these other anti-racism programs would be division, right? Because that's the problem to solve, is division. But because that is the core, it becomes almost the solution, right? Just inadvertently, right? But for you, the core is unity. For you, the core was, these are all these things that everyone already loves, and let's tap into that to solve these kind of peripheral problems of we're miscommunicating, we're missing one another, we're not seeing one another. If we all dig into that one thing, then maybe we can correct this. I feel like it's just we have it backwards. Focusing so much on the division and almost then taking the division and using it as the solution is so much of why I think the tragedy occurs. Would you agree?
Yeah, I think that for a lot of the other anti-racism programs, the creators didn't stop to ask themselves, well, where does this division come from? How does division manifest psychologically in the human psyche? Why do we divide ourselves into these sort of boxes? Is there any existing tool or platform that can help us stop dividing ourselves? Which I think the arts is the answer. But yeah, there seems to be no kind of curiosity on that front, and no deeper questing into the human condition as such. And so things are taken for granted, essentially. And the problem with taking things for granted is that if I take things for granted as a human being, I mean, I'm already susceptible to self-deception as a human being, naturally, right? But if I take things for granted, I'm especially susceptible to self-deception. I'm not questioning myself. I'm not, I'm not questioning the assumptions that I have or the assumptions that I've developed over time. And it's interesting because if one is more open and one is more curious, I think about themselves, then questioning one's own assumption no longer becomes a threat, right? It no longer becomes something that would undermine your identity and in the existential sense of the word. And I think that's ultimately what we're getting at here. There was a great conversation that Thomas Chatterton Williams had with this woman. I forget her name. They were talking about race. I wish I remembered her name, but shout out to whoever you are. They were talking about race, and she was saying, you know, I don't know what I would do without race. And she's African American, I believe. And she was like, I don't know.
Brianna Joy Gray?
Yes.
Yeah.
And she was like, I don't know what I would do. And I was like, yes, this is the heart of the issue. Like, it's an existential crisis to simply, in my mind, to simply tell people to get rid of this thing that you've been defining yourself for so long, right? And defining your entire world and your entire ideology and your like the way you see things, to tell people to simply give that up without giving them something to replace that, I think is actually somewhat foolish. But in general, you could distill that down to questioning one's own assumptions that one has held for such a long time. That can come with an existential identity crisis. And so if you don't give people the proper tools to deal with that, you are pushing people into, you know, potentially nihilistic limbo, which is very, very dangerous. So I don't want to underestimate the challenge of getting people to question things that they associate with their identity. It's actually very, very fraught, you know, and we should take that seriously.
So there's two things here, but I think the first thing I want to delve into with you is still hanging on to the art part. Is we see so many people reacting to art in this kind of backwards way, an opposite way to the way that you kind of advocate for, which is the hyper focus on identity and the hyper focus on the divisions between the art, right? So like, you know, for example, like Beyoncé and Kendrick Lamar belong more to a certain group of people than to anybody else, right? And that
we should
totally
talk about
goes
that, by the way.
Yeah, right. So like, but like that goes against your entire thing of like, no, everyone resonates with this.
Yeah.
Right. Now we're putting up fences, we're drawing lines, and we're saying, no. You don't resonate with this. I resonate with this because of these characteristics that I have that you don't. Right. And then there's just the obsessive kind of devotion to quotas about, you know, identity quotas and things like that. And all these things that kind of, they start to cut this whole beautiful artistic landscape up and prevent people from making that connection. Right. And the way that I see it is that beautiful moment on this soccer field, the soccer pitch, where all these people are singing this song wouldn't be able to happen because there are people who wouldn't be allowed to be there. You know, by dint of this sort of divisive sort of thinking. What do you think about that?
That's a lot. That's a lot, Angel.
Well, Melissa's not here, so I got to make sure that I'm like carrying the weight. This is my first solo show.
Yeah.
So
No, I appreciate that. Doing a great job. Listen, I would say that it's complicated, right? It's complicated. So I'll give you a great example. We're going to dive right in. So take Beyonce's Black is King. I don't know if you've seen this. Have you seen it?
No, I haven't seen that.
Okay. So
no, I haven't.
I go so hard for this film. I think it's one of the most beautiful films Beyonce has ever created. I would say Beyonce has outdone herself. But for many, and understandably so, the title is problematic, right? Now, what is Black is King about? Black is King is a retelling of The Lion King. But it's a telling of the African-American story. And not just the African-American in the sense of Americans, but also Africa and the African diaspora. And it's this retelling of the story. So you see there's this guy who plays Simba, there's this woman who plays Nala, there's a guy who plays Scar, and so on and so forth. And there are all of these interesting elements that make for an incredibly conservative story, actually, because it's about a guy who, grows up in a traditional family where family is really important, and honoring the elders and honoring the ancestors is very important. But then he sort of drifts off into a kind of hyper-consumerist mindset, and loses his way and has to be reborn, and then go back home and rediscover his roots and become the true king, right? And it is simultaneously a story of rebirth of a people who experienced slavery and sort of in the process lost their way, but had the capacity to be reborn and become psychologically whole, essentially. It's a very Jungian tale in that way. And there's part of me that's like, this is beautiful, this is incredible, this is amazing, this is gorgeous, everyone should see it regardless of their skin color, whatever. And then there's part of me that understands the sort of reflexive conservative response to say the title is problematic, Beyoncé is claiming that Black people are superior, blah, 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 blah. Which I don't think that's what she's doing, by the way. I think it's far more complex than that, and it's far more nuanced. And so how is this related to your question? When you're talking about playing music, right? There's this idea that you want to achieve harmony, right? But to achieve, harmony requires diversity in a way, right? Harmony requires different instruments that are not all the same, right? And to make an analogy, to extend that further, I would say harmony requires cultures that are not all the same. I would say in many ways, this is the American project, right? E pluribus unum, out of many one. So it requires a kind of a celebration of difference and the attempt to celebrate difference coming together as one. Not getting rid of your difference, but coming together as one. So the question for me is, how does art play a role in advancing that mission? How can it play a role in advancing that mission? But what are the things that stop us from accessing it, right? Because if you take a film like Black is King, I could put myself in a conservative white person's shoes and and empathize with that position and see myself, having a problem at the very least with the title, right? But I would never want that to stop me from even daring to engage with the material, right? And thinking that, maybe there's something I can get out of this as a human being, right? And so the failure to empathize, to put yourself within someone else's shoes, within a totally different culture's shoes, has a damaging effect on both sides, as it were, right? It has a damaging effect on the person who let's say in the Ibram Kendi-esque paradigm, who cannot see a white person as their brother or sister, right? In the true sense of the word. It stops them from being able to do that. And it also stops the white conservative or the white Republican from being able to engage with this piece of film because the title is threatening to my sense of identity. And so I could never meet you halfway. And this is, again, a tragedy, but I do think that art is complicated and art is supposed to be complicated. And it's allowed to be complicated, and we should relish that and bask in that without feeling threatened, simply because we don't necessarily see ourselves in it on the surface. Because I actually think anyone could watch, I truly believe that anyone could watch Black is King and still see themselves reflected in that piece.
No, I fully
I
agree.
said a lot there, so.
No, it's great. That's exactly, that's
Yeah.
it. We're totally on the thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
I absolutely agree with you. And I think the issue that I was trying to touch on is the fact that not only is this, hypothetical conservative person having trouble seeing themselves in it,
Yeah.
but they are actively being disincentivized from seeing themselves in it by the people who do see themselves in it, right? They think they have a claim to it that this person does not. And they're saying, no, this doesn't belong to you. You need to get out.
Right.
When the point of art and the beauty of it is, no, you don't need to get out. In fact, you're already here and you may not know it yet. Yeah. And that's what this is supposed to show you, right? Yeah. So it's a twofold problem. It's a difficulty identifying, but then there's a kind of people putting the fence up and saying, no, you don't get to identify with this.
Right. And then the response is, you're right. I don't get to identify with this, right? I don't identify with this. I hate this, right? And then there's this reciprocal mimetic, behavior all the way down, which makes it more likely for polarization and hatred and bigotry to occur.
Yeah, it's a disenchantment, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And it is tragic, as you said, because that is such a beautiful avenue. I mean, I'm thinking of Daryl Davis, who we had on the show. He's an advisor. I'm sure you know who he is.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
And
we teach him in Theory of Enchantment.
Yeah. I mean, how could you not, right? He's like a superhero, but he's talking about how he ends up talking to this KKK member, someone who by all, reasoning would never even speak to him. But the reason that he was approached, the reason Daryl was approached by this person is because Daryl had just played music and was just playing, rock and roll music, Little Richard and stuff like that. And this person came up and said, wow, you play just like Jerry Lee Lewis. I've never heard a black man play like that before. Yeah. That was the bridge. The bridge was this, Daryl's playing connected with this guy. He couldn't help it. He felt it in his bones. You know, the music was too powerful. He had to overcome all that bigotry to just walk over to him and say, I've never heard a black man play like that before. And then of course, Daryl says, well, who do you think taught Jerry Lee Lewis how to play that stuff? Right. It's people like Little Richard. Right. So it all ends up connected. And it's funny that you mentioned Black is King being a retelling of The Lion King, because The Lion King is a retelling of Hamlet.
Right.
And so it always goes back, right? And it's like, look, we don't own any of this. Like either we all own all of it, or none of us own any of it. Yeah. Right? So I think that's such a beautiful, beautiful point to make and to highlight. It's like we're all already here, or none of us are there yet. And I think it's clear which one is actually true. Yeah. But getting to that, let me ask you about the Kardashians, because because we had a little bit of a tiff about this, right? Like I made the usual jokes, but you have this very strong. This.
Yes.
Yeah. So you have this very strong feeling about no. I'm missing the point, because what I see and what many people see is it's vapid, it's very superficial. And it's very just consumerist and obsessed with, superficiality and all that sort of stuff. The usual spiel that you hear. And I'm not someone who watches the show. My wife watches it a little bit, but I never saw anything that I could get out of it. But you came at me with this whole other thing. So give me the spiel. Let's fill in our listeners, our viewers on the spiel. Tell me why I'm wrong. Tell me why I should admire.
It's not that you're wrong.
Or care about it. Yeah.
It's not that you're wrong, Angel. It's all of that, by the way. But it's so much more. It's so much more. So I had the impression that, this is what the Kardashians were all about. And this is sort of what they could be reduced to. And then my friend told me I should actually watch it, and she thought that I would get something out of it. And then I started watching it, I think in 2020, and I was like, oh my God, I love the Kardashians. And I think it was because I wasn't expecting the heavy emphasis on family. That is just a huge thread throughout the entire show. Almost every single episode that I've seen is about family and how can we stay together as a family, and how can we maintain a deep, loving relationship as a family with all of the drama that comes with the territory of being a Kardashian, right? Of being in the limelight.
There's a lot.
Yeah. of dating guys who may or may not, have their ish together, etc. Like, throughout all of those ebbs and flows, one of the central themes of the show that I found was family. And I was just not expecting that. And it's an incredibly traditional show in that sense. And that's what I really came to love about it.
Yeah, so I can see that.
Yeah.
But actually, I didn't mean to do this, but I inadvertently trapped you, I think, because...
Oh, goodness. Here we go.
Well, no, because that leads me to a criticism, right? And that is something that people like even Jordan Peterson get, which is that, okay, I can see how you're reading that into it, but
I've heard this response, by the way, but continue.
Yeah. So it's like, okay, so I can see how you're reading that into it, but you seem to be prioritizing that over the parts of it that are harmful or toxic or problematic.
Here's the thing. I have heard from people like they're like, little girls look up to the Kardashians and to the Jenner family for aesthetics and makeup, and that's harmful. And I'm like, it is not the Kardashians' duty to parent your children, right? I didn't start watching the Kardashians until I was like 26 years old, so I don't think I'm reading into it per se. I think that the show covers mature topics, and it requires a certain maturity level to watch it. Like, I wouldn't let my kids watch it, right? But like, I don't think that means that I'm reading into it. I think it means that parents need to do better jobs with choosing what to expose their kids to. And I've heard this silly response, which I cannot for the life of me fathom, which is that, oh, well, they're going to be exposed to it anyway, so I might as well just let them sit in front of the TV and watch it, ad nauseum, which is the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard in my life. It's like, that's not how parenting works. I mean, that's not how my parents raised me. Let me speak for myself, right? I don't think that's how parenting works. If my parents didn't want me exposed to something, to the best of their ability, they made sure I wasn't exposed to it, right? And eventually I might be exposed to it. But I do think there's a kind of reckless abandon that people have when they talk about the Kardashians, insofar as it impacts like young kids. And I just don't think that that's necessarily fair to the Kardashians. And again, I'm not saying that there's definitely vanity. There's definitely vapidness. There's definitely, many of the things that you talked about. But there's also this other virtuous stuff, right? Like, to say nothing of the fact that Kim Kardashian strikes me as an incredibly moral person, especially given all the things that she's done with criminal justice reform and pursuing a law degree and, all these things. So I think that most people who are dismissive of the Kardashians perhaps read into it all the things that you're saying without taking into account the other stuff that is there that I think is good,
Yeah. Okay. So I can go with you there.
Okay.
And I think that, like I'm kind of playing devil's advocate here because I do agree with you.
Yeah.
But this criticism actually translates, or it can translate. I don't know if you've gotten this, but it can translate into theory of enchantment as well. Which is that, you're teaching people how to love. You're focusing on the love part. You're not dealing with the problems. You're not dealing with, our society today is such and such a way. And you're just kind of giving this pie in the sky, and I get this all the time too for my own kind of approach. Yeah. But, it's all, hippy dippy. We're all singing Kumbaya. Meanwhile, some people are being killed. Some people are being victimized. And you don't seem to be dealing with that. So how would you react to that?
You're just like, boom, boom, boom. You're segueing from the Kardashians to, to why are you telling people to turn the other cheek? No.
Right. Yeah, that's exactly. Yeah, I get that all the time. Yeah. I get that all the time. Like, you're just rolling over and letting people be, you're just allowing white supremacy and blah, blah, blah.
This is a difficult question because it's a question that, I think I could talk for hours about this question, but I won't do that. I would say that love is a very hard thing. Love is not a pie in the sky, hippy dippy, whatever that means, thing. It's a very difficult practice. And again, like I said, a nearly impossible practice. And it's actually easier to just say to the other person that you have a problem with, or to say to the other group of people whose skin color you despise or whatever, to say, F you. It's so much easier to do that, right? It's so much easier to let an emotion, let's say of anger, spring up in you. And instead of being conscious about how to channel that anger properly, to simply let it explode in a destructive and diabolical fashion. It's actually way easier to do that. And it's way easier in that sense to also destroy society. It's much harder to build something in a sustainable fashion. And it's much harder to love because loving requires a kind of not just psychological wholeness, but a practice that leads to psychological wholeness, which is hard. If I have a temper, if I am easily driven to anger when someone cuts me off in traffic, or when someone, treats me in an inferior manner because of my skin color, it's easier for me to simply treat that person in the same way they've treated me. And what would society gain from that? I'm not sure. I don't think you would gain much. One of the 4 elements that Dr. King said is necessary for a successful nonviolent campaign is self-purification, right? And he was talking about this practice of learning to not hate your enemy, right? And that requires just so much work on the self in order to do that. And that is way harder than all the things that we've spoken about thus far. It's way harder to say to yourself, oh, maybe I harbor some of the same prejudices that my enemy harbors towards me. Maybe I actually harbor those same prejudices towards her for the same reasons, i.e. skin color, right? Oh, maybe I have to check myself, and maybe I have to unlearn the things that that have caused me to think in this way. Yes, I have been traumatized, but perhaps by this person or the society persecuting me, right? But then what is my responsibility in response to that trauma, right? Responsibility, this is a musical word. Responsibility is about response. And there's this whole call and response thing, right, that exists in many different cultures, including sort of the African-American Baptist tradition, which is a musical term. And the call and response sensibility is, I would say, the exact opposite of a victimhood/patient-centered mentality. When you have a victimhood mentality, the problem is not that you are saying that I have been a victim of this. The problem is when you begin to identify exclusively or primarily as a victim and say to yourself, I have no capacity to take responsibility for the situation that I'm in. And to take responsibility for the situation that you're in, especially when you have experienced some kind of persecution is to unlearn the ways in which that persecution might actually turn you into a persecutor. And this is really what Dr. King was trying to get at when he talked about a lot of these things in his sermons, which we really haven't studied as a society at all, unfortunately. But like, what is my responsibility as a human being? How can I respond in a way to the situation so that I don't perpetuate the same injustices in reverse, right? That's a much harder question to ask than to say, I'm just going to react, right? Which is not from the same sort of like call and response sensibility, but it's an imitation, right? You're reacting, you're imitating what was done to you, which is easier and instinctual. And so that's what I would say. I would say that the easier way out is to just descend into us versus them, polarized ways of thinking. And what we are proposing is the harder thing to do, ultimately.
I agree. Yeah. It's definitely harder, but it's the more meaningful thing. I liken it to fast food versus, having a healthy diet, right? Like, people don't even realize that they feel awful because they're so used to how they feel.
Yeah. Yes,
eating eating their junk food, they think, no, I feel fine. But then if they switch their diet and suddenly they're having a really healthy and nutritious diet, after a few weeks, they'll find themselves feeling more energetic and maybe more kind of just generally happy. And they'll be like, wow, I didn't realize how awful I actually felt before. Yeah. Because it was normal for me. But now I can see the difference. But the thing is, getting people to eat their vegetables is really hard. So how are you going to get people to eat their vegetables?
That's a good analogous question. I think that the way that Theory of Enchantment becomes attractive to people is through this idea that you will potentially encounter or experience a state of joy if you go through the training. And and joy is such, for me personally, joy is such a like I want to be living in the state of joy at all times. Right? Like when I meditate in the morning and I say a blessing at the end of my meditation, one of the things that I say is, teach me to practice joy. Like, I want to be joyful in every situation, in every encounter, tragedy, hardship, happiness, whatever. Like, I want to experience joy, because if I can experience joy, then I'm going to be less likely to react to someone or something that's negative, and more likely to respond, right, in that musical sense of the word. In the same way that Daryl Davis responded, right? He could have imitated the KKK people, but he did not. He didn't react. He responded. And by doing so, he completely offered a different model for them to imitate. And that's the beauty of one of the beautiful things about being human, is that as human beings, we imitate each other, right? And Renee Girard has spoken about this, and Luke Burgess has written about this, but like, that can be a problem if we imitate, just polarized behavior, or us versus them behavior. But if we can imitate other people's joyousness, if we can imitate other people's openness, curiosity, right, wonder, then we can actually change the dynamic, and we can actually scale joy, which I think would be a really cool thing. So that's what we're offering. If I could boil it down to one kind of existential orientation, it would be joy. So
teaching people how to love and how to experience joy.
Yeah.
That's a good elevator pitch.
Right? Like, who doesn't want that? Who doesn't want that?
I think that your only problem would be skepticism that you can deliver, but I know you can deliver.
Sure, yeah. I mean, listen, there's no guarantee, right?
Right.
I'm gonna try my best.
Yeah, and the attempt is better than no attempt at all.
Yeah,
right?
For sure. Yeah.
So, speaking of unlearning, I really wanted to ask you about this. You mentioned Thomas Chatterton Williams earlier. And I know that you've read the book Racecraft, which is something that I've been talking about a lot.
Yeah.
And
I think you pushed me to read it, actually.
I might have. I think I asked you, like, hey, have you read this yet? You need to read this. And then I saw that you were reading it and I was super excited. So I would love to hear your thoughts. What do you know, what did you take away from the book? By the way, listeners, viewers, this is Racecraft, The Soul of Inequality in American Life, I think is the subtitle. And it's by Barbara and Karen Fields. I highly recommend it. I talk about it all the time. I've talked about it on the podcast, but I would love to hear what you thought of it and how it's shaped your worldview.
So I finished Racecraft over Thanksgiving week last year, and I thought it was very good. I thought it was really good in terms of like showing me the economic underpinnings of racism and how racism has been used by a lot of sort of like historically upper class whites to keep poor whites from rebelling or from, creating a class sort of partnership with poor Blacks, if you will. So I really learned a lot about that, about the economic elements that have shaped and informed racism. And I also learned a great deal about how Jim Crow in particular was set up for that reason, to basically satiate poor whites so that they wouldn't rise up and try to overthrow people in the upper class who were sort of not giving them resources and things like that. Now, the ending was interesting. I don't know if you remember the ending. The ending was sort of like, it was also interesting because it kept calling it, there was a phrase that it kept referring to race as. I actually have it. Hold on, let me grab it. I don't know if you remember the term. It was like a term related to, but not quite religion.
Ideology?
No.
Is it ideology? I don't remember. It's been a bit since I read it now.
Let me see if I can find it right quick. Because it actually makes a distinction between religion and the word that I'm trying to find. This is gonna bother me. Hold on, let me just because it was a good term.
Yeah,
it was such a good term. I'm not gonna.
It's a dense book.
It's very dense. Yeah.
It took me.
Heads up to your audience. It's very.
Yeah, I've talked about it before. I had trouble reading it. It was hard for me to absorb.
Definitely one of the great insights that came out of this book was like racism came first and then race was invented, right? Not the other way around, which we get wrong all the time in our contemporary discussions about race. And of course, it's called Racecraft because it compares racism to witchcraft.
Right.
But yeah, I can't find the term. But anyway, the ending was interesting because I felt like it was arguing that race should totally be done away with, essentially. And I'm not sure that I agree with that if there's nothing to replace it. And again, this goes back to my whole point earlier about people having identity crises. And I would have loved to see the Field sisters explore that a little bit, because I think that they take the cost of getting rid of race for granted because they didn't explore the cost of what an existential identity crisis would do to I don't know, millions of people.
And I've gotten this in kind of having these conversations now, especially after the book, and there's a lot going on. And I think, Dr. Sheena Mason talks about this. We had her on the show a couple episodes ago. And I think one of the major issues is that we have conflated so many things with race. we've conflated community and culture and ethnicity and, history, a shared history with race. And a lot of people see getting rid of race as getting rid of all of those things. In my view, I think I understand that because of the conflation. I understand because those things are kind of intertwined in the way that we think and speak about it. But for me, it's actually liberating those things. It's actually expanding those things and making them more powerful and more fruitful, because they're not tied to this very limiting and very oppressive kind of idea. So it's actually, it's hard to see because we're swimming in it. But if we were to extricate the concept of race from all of these things, it would actually open us up to a lot of the stuff that we've been talking about, which is, recognizing how much we can connect with, like the Harlem Renaissance, for example, right? Like that belongs to everyone. And it's actually terrible that we feel it only belongs to a certain group of people. And even to that group of people, it's a limiting thing, because if it belonged to everyone, its importance would be not magnified, but actually identified. It would actually be recognized for how monumental it really was, because it becomes a human thing, and yes, of course there's subgroups, and there's, cultures within cultures and all that sort of stuff. And none of that would go away. But just this miasma that we're in, where we see these divisions as fundamental. That's the part that's what I got out of the book is just the recognition that racism came first. And that the act of racism actually creates these divisions and makes them feel real. That's the part that I think is so powerful. And I wish we could find some way to communicate it more easily, because there is that problem that you mentioned.
It's interesting though, because one of the things that James Baldwin said in his conversation with Nikki Giovanni was that he was happy that the My Black is Beautiful movement had become a movement, but then he was excited to see it die at some point, or no longer be necessary. But what that strikes me, or how that strikes me, is linear, meaning I'm not sure that you can actually get to, this is interesting, I'm not sure that you can actually get to the end of race without, there's part of me that thinks that the current moment that we're living in right now is actually an incredible opportunity, because what it suggests is that people are searching for psychological wholeness and going about it in all kinds of problematic ways. But the search itself is promising in and of itself. And so there is this question of like, you cannot transcend race without going through race. It's a question, it's a hypothetical. I don't know if it's true or not, but it seems to me that was what James Baldwin was sort of getting at. And I'm not sure, like, I would be curious what someone like Thomas would say to that hypothetical. But like, I've always thought about that ever since I saw that conversation between the two of them. But I'm wondering what you think of that.
Yeah, I feel like we've been trying to go through it. And I think that we've been kind of getting caught in the meat hooks of all the different ways that we kind of, well, mixing metaphors, but like we keep kind of popping our heads out of the water of it for like a split second and then just diving right back in. Yeah. And I think that's the problem, right? So it's imagine like the Matrix, except Morpheus tells you that, the world isn't real and that there's a thing called the Matrix. And then he shows you what it's like. Okay. And then when you go back into the Matrix, you forget every single time and you just start acting normal again. And you don't get those cool superpowers, because the cool superpowers come from you understanding that the Matrix is not real.
Okay. Right? I love that you brought up this metaphor, because I think I'm kind of learning how to articulate the issue that it might have. I don't know if I have it, but I think I have it. So I just recently watched all of the Matrixes, And it's a great cult classic, but there's a problem with The Matrix. And without getting too deep into the woods, or the weeds rather, talk about mixing metaphors. The problem with The Matrix is that The Matrix is a Gnostic film. So like, Gnosticism, it has its good parts and its bad parts, but Gnosticism, the whole worldview of Gnosticism is like, there's like an evil God, and then there's a higher good God. And then we have to like overcome the evil God. And so like the world of The Matrix is obviously run by the architect, right? The evil God. And then and Neo is the one, and we have to bring it. So that's one mystical tradition, right? Gnosticism is one particular mystical tradition that was, sort of came out of this Neoplatonic era in the ancient world. But there's another mystical tradition, or other mystical traditions, that are more Taoist, I would say, and that are more Eastern. Not all of them. Some of them can be found in the Judeo-Christian world, but are more Eastern, that basically sees as its goal a unity of opposites, right? Or coming together of a balancing of opposites, if you will, as opposed to light destroying the darkness, right? A kind of balance between light and darkness. You can see this in the Tao Te Ching and the yin yang symbol, and even in elements of Hasidic Judaism, you can see this.
Yeah.
And so there's part of me that anytime I come across a Gnostic sort of matrixy take on race, or on other contemporary problems that our culture faces, I'm like, I don't know that I share that philosophical belief system fundamentally, because I'm much more drawn to Taoism, and I'm much more drawn to that kind of, how can we bring a harmonious balance to, because the theory of enchantment is all about like from a historical perspective, we believe that racism in the West occurred when we as a civilization, because of our love of scientific certainty, and because of our love of knowledge, and what then became an obsession with scientific certainty, led to fear of the darkness, because it led to fear of the unknown, right? So we had this obsession with the known, and then it led to fear of the unknown, and we made the unknown synonymous with darkness, right? And so we started to say, oh, the darkness is all bad, right? And then we took that darkness and then we projected it onto the physically darker peoples of West Africa, and then we called their cultures inferior, and then we enslaved them. So there's this Gnostic, thread that arguably is the source of our problems in the first place. And so I am hesitant to endorse what would seem like a Gnostic solution. I'll stop there.
Okay. I see what you're getting at. And I think my view is that the two pursuits aren't actually in conflict. Because everything that you just laid out is still something we need to do, and it's still something that's important. The only thing we don't need to do, and the thing that I don't think is in any way required to accomplish the mission that you just laid out, is accepting this nonsense concept that we have been steeped in this entire time. So we can just reject that wholeheartedly because we recognize it as nonsense. So like, even though, you can have this kind of matrix thing where you can recognize the matrix and you can say that's not the real world and escaping it is a good thing. But once you're in the real world, you still have to do all that other work. You know what I mean? That's kind of like, you still have to make sure the plumbing works in Zion. And you know what I'm saying? So to keep that metaphor going. So I feel like that's where it is for me, is that everything you're doing would actually be made easier if we just remove that thing. And again, it's part of that project is letting people understand, or getting people to understand, that none of the things that they actually value would be lost. Only the terrible things are the things that are being removed, right? Because it was a terrible thing that was grafted onto all the beautiful things.
I mean, I would have some questions. I don't necessarily disagree with the project that you've laid out. I would just have some questions as to how you would go about doing that. Especially,
yeah, that's the tough part.
especially
Tough part.
like, you know, if you belong to a group of people who have this historical narrative, right, of experiencing slavery and then overcoming slavery and then experiencing a skin color based systemic persecution and then overcoming persecution, it becomes very difficult for a people who feels resilient because of that history to then say to them, to then take race out of it, right? It becomes very difficult to
that's the
that.
problem. Yeah,
that.
because it's all like twisted together with all of those things that are valuable, the resilience and the history and the community.
Yeah.
But it's kind of like, to go back to the racecraft, the witchcraft analogy, right? All those women who stood up and fought against, the witch trials and all that sort of thing. And the movement that came about afterwards and all that stuff, all that is still real. All that is there. And at no point did witches actually become real.
Yeah.
And at no point do we need to think witches are real.
Yes, but the problem
in order for all that.
The problem is, Angel, that some women today do see the term witch as a kind of, feminist celebration, right? Because of that history. And then we're all the way back to square one, right? So
it's tough. You're right. It's tough.
Yeah.
Well, Chloe, it's been so great talking to you.
You're like, on that note.
I mean, I don't think we're definitely not gonna close that can of worms today. But I do want to make sure to ask you the final question that we ask all our guests.
Okay.
And if I'm not mistaken, you're the first guest who is not a fair advisor who we are asking this question.
Yes, that's correct.
So the question is, our whole focus here at FAIR, everything that we're trying to do is similar to what you're doing, which is presenting a pro-human alternative to all the issues that we've discussed, all the stuff that we've talked about today. So I would love to hear what does pro-human mean to you? How do you conceptualize that? And what would you say are ways that everyday people can adopt a more pro-human approach to all the stuff that we discussed?
Okay, let me try to give this question the seriousness that it deserves and not give you a fly-by-my-seat answer. I mean, the human being is inexhaustible, to quote John Vervaeke. And what that means is that we always have the capacity to transcend ourselves. So if yesterday I was really, crappy to someone who cut me off in traffic, I love to use the cutting off in traffic analogy, but because it's so pervasive. No, if someone cut me off in traffic and I was really crappy towards them, like say I gave them the finger, and then I started to think about, not doing that. And I started to try to think about the kind of person that I want to be in the world. And then the next time someone cut me off in traffic, let's say I didn't give them the finger, and I thought of them as, oh, maybe they're, rushing to the hospital. Maybe they're having an emergency, or maybe they're not having an emergency. Maybe they're really excited about something, and they're just, if I had the graciousness to extend to them that kind of thinking, then I have transcended myself, because yesterday I was one way and today I'm a completely different person in that regard. So the human being is inexhaustible. And so to be pro-human in my mind is to always keep in mind, and always try to realize that fact about yourself and also about others. And what advice would I give? I would say to practice shadow boxing. So shadow boxing is hard, but it's got great results. When you shadow box, you become attuned to what is triggering your ego. And you know your ego is triggered when you start to think of yourself as better than another person. And so what you do to change that is you shadow box. And so you identify a person who triggers that feeling in you. And then you identify the behavior that you don't like about that person. You identify how that shows up within yourself. And you practice that all the time. And what that does is it enables you to stop this sort of like act of separating yourself from another person in a kind of us versus them mindset. And it also enables you to practice compassion for other people, even while simultaneously identifying their behavior as, wrong or problematic. And it keeps you grounded, it keeps you humble, and maybe even a little joyful at times. So that would be my advice.
That's beautiful. As expected, a beautiful response. Chloé, thank you so much for joining us on Fair Perspectives.
Thanks, Angel.
Thank you for listening to Fair Perspectives. If you'd like to support the show, you can do it by subscribing on YouTube and on your favorite podcast platform and leaving us a positive rating and review. You can also access exclusive podcast content, such as Q&As and bonus episodes, by visiting us and signing up at fairperspectives.org. For weekly fair news and opinion pieces by members of the fair community, visit our Substack at fairforall.substack.com and tune into Fair News Weekly wherever you listen to podcasts. If you'd like to join or support the pro-human movement, visit us at fairforall.org/join us. Thanks again, and see you next time.